Hi, folks. It is a pleasure to welcome you on a thrilling new episode of Cyber Narratives. In today's episode, we are speaking with researcher Daniele Lain, who works at the ETH of Zurich. Daniele set out to study the impact of education on phishing, and he did this at the Swiss Post on a massive scale and a long period of time which had never been done before. That is 14,000 people over 15 months. And that gave us the answer to many stereotypes that we had previously. Like, for instance, why do women seem to click more on phishing than their male counterparts? We'll get the answer in this episode. 3 learnings that you'll get from this episode. Number 1, how hackers use employees to hurt their own organizations while using phishing. Number 2, the 3 types of profile that exist when it comes to employees. Number 1, there's the repeated clickers. Number 2, there's the normal. And number 3, the superstars. And we'll see how to treat each one in order to maximize protection. And number 3, we'll see how we can build a strategy on a corporate level in order to make sure that we have the highest possible defenses against phishing. With this said, let's dive in. I just wanted to mention that your study is called, I have it here, Phishing in Organizations, Finding from a Large Scale and Long-Term Study. In just a few sentences, can you define for us what phishing refers to?
So the main idea of phishing is basically tricking someone by impersonating some authority, for example, or some coworker or some external entity. And by impersonation, you're trying to trick someone into doing something that is not what they want. So the most common case of phishing is phishing emails, where you receive an email that claims to be, for example, from your IT services or from someone who's higher up in the company than you, or from a direct coworker that says, hey, you need to do this. Click on this link, download this attachment and enable the macros. See this invoice and pay it. But also more subtle ones. For example, please transfer some amount of money to this bank account. And this can happen in different ways. So emails so far have been the main vector for phishing because in emails you only get text, right? And other media are more difficult to replicate. But now we are seeing a lot of these scams being played out also by SMS services, by online chats, say WhatsApp and Telegram and Signal. And now, with the advancement of artificial intelligence, we are starting to see these type of scams done over the telephone. So we are used to telephone scams, like old school telephone scams, I think, where you get a call where they pretend to be your phone company, your utilities company, and they ask for something. But this is because you have no idea actually who these companies are. And now we are seeing an advance in sophisticated scams where you get phone calls from people that pretend to be your employer, your colleagues, for example, or your superiors, because now you can fake voice, for example, and you can impersonate a specific voice. And this is also on the rise. Soon, maybe we might even get video of that. But so basically, to summarize, phishing is any attempt of a threat actor, of a criminal, basically, to impersonate someone and make someone do something they don't want to do, but they think they have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just a question, so we talk a lot about phishing, but there's other ways that hackers can get into our systems. They can use vulnerabilities and things like this. Why is phishing specifically such a powerful tool in the arsenal of the for the hacker?
I think there's a couple of reasons for that. So first of all, phishing is targeting the human factor of a computer system, so the user themselves, which are often considered to be the weakest link in the chain. This is debatable, in my opinion, but it is true that people can be tricked, especially if there's confusion, for example, in a company in terms of procedures, in terms of how things should be done properly. And also, it's always about a cat and mouse game between attackers and defenders in computer systems, whether it is technical, like vulnerabilities and exploits and more sophisticated cyber attacks, but also phishing. And in phishing, stuff moves a bit more quickly, and attacks are cheaper usually. So when we have an attacker trying to leverage a vulnerability on someone's browser, for example, or on someone's messaging applications. These are vulnerabilities that can cost a lot of money. They require a lot of research. They require attackers to acquire maybe pieces of the tool chain they need to do proper cyber attack. And often, maybe it's also not possible if things are properly done in an organization, then cyber attacks are very expensive, the ones that target software. Instead, targeting employees might be as simple as registering a domain that is a few letters away or a tiny typo away from the company, and
Hmm.
then sending a bunch of emails, which is, of course, very cheap and gives you also immediate feedback on whether it's working. So this is why I think phishing is still the main risk for a lot of companies, and this is why there's a lot of attention around this topic.
Yeah, I mean, even if attackers think much like business people is something we've talked about. They think about how can I get what I want, which is an attack, at the cheapest possible cost. And phishing is one of these tools, especially when you consider that there's so many employees, so many potential targets they can have. And your results actually talk about, because it's such a large scale with a number of people and over time, we have very good studies. So perhaps it's a good time to dive into this. So there's a few findings from there. You talked about a few of them. The one I like to get into first is the situation of repeated clickers and people who report. So here's how I understood a bit I interpreted your paper. So you did several things. You measured the number of clicks that people gave on a phishing, how many people failed for it. And on the other side, you measured how many people reported the phishing. And so I drew in my mind the following chart, and you can tell me what you think about it.
Mhm.
But the idea is on the x-axis, we have how much people care about cybersecurity, and you can maybe define a bit more what care means. And on the y-axis, you have number of people. And imagine normal curve where you have, at the left side, people who don't really care and who are likely to click. In the middle, you have what you said in your paper as eventually employees will fall for phishing. And at
Yes.
the right side, you have, let's say, the best in class people who will actually push the the push on that click button on the click on the report phishing button. Now, my idea here, did first of all, do you agree with this model? And second, what do you think psychologically happens that there's different profiles like this?
I actually think I agree. What we saw, interestingly, that actually probably validates the description we just made of this intuitive graph is that we did not observe, and this may be a bit more hidden in the paper, we did not observe many people that after falling for our simulations and maybe even realizing it was an attack, or maybe even realizing they might have been victims of something that wasn't an exercise, we didn't observe many of them then reporting the email. So basically, um, I don't know whether this is for lack of care on cybersecurity or lack of awareness of what is going on. I tend to go with the second, lack of awareness of the attack that was happening, because we interviewed quite some people, especially of these what we called repeated clickers, so people that fell many times over the year and a half,
Mm-hmm.
and the general the, the, the general remarks that we got was that these people, of course, care about cybersecurity in their company environment. So they are all very aware of the consequence of a cyber attack. They are very well aware that they need to be careful, and probably they were simply lacking the tools and the knowledge to realize what was going on, to realize that this fake login form that was mimicking their employer's login when they entered the credentials, and then they got redirected to the homepage of the company, for example, was actually a symptom of a cyber attack rather than something not working. Because attackers do thrive in this confusion. And so this part here is a part that cares and probably needs better education. And this is the most vulnerable part. The middle part, the eventually will fall, I agree. This is people that might report, this is people that might fall. Um, and this is probably also your bulk, that if you're taking care of the leftmost part of the most vulnerable ones, will benefit from your education. And then, yeah, security superstars, we observed a lot of them in even in our study, people who rarely, if ever, fall for any of our exercise, but they were also very timely in reporting phishing emails. And by very timely, I mean matter of minutes within delivery. So this is actually very good news for crowdsourcing the protection of your company, because of course, companies want to have systems before any email enters their organization that, of course, try to detect cyber attacks, try to detect phishing, try to detect impersonation. But these systems will always be fallible in a way, right? Because it's a cat and mouse game, as we said before.
Mm.
And so eventually, a dedicated scammer will find a way to evade a filter. And at that point, your last line of defense is users. Users realizing what's going on, and users reporting very quickly the email and being like, hey, I received this. This is clearly wrong. Because then your IT can get visibility on this cyber attack that is going on. And if an email is reported within minutes, it means it's probably also arriving to other people, and you can block it immediately for everyone. And so you just need a handful of these dedicated users to build a very effective crowd protection. But of course,
Mhm.
these users are also, these employees are a minority. Just like luckily, the ones that keep on falling and keep on being impermeable somehow to training are also a minority in companies.
I see. And so how for these how can you, let's say, make sure that you have enough of these cybersecurity superstars, as we call them, incentives? How do you recommend dealing with these so that they keep doing what they do?
This is a great question. So it's very difficult to answer, unfortunately, but we are investigating it. So the paper is not out yet. We are writing it these days, but we did some follow-up studies on how to keep people engaged with the idea of reporting phishing. And we did test incentives. We did test incentives that were communicated in advance. So we were saying, hey, if you report at least one phishing email, because you will receive some as part of continuous training in the next handful of weeks, you will receive a prize, you will receive a small bonus, you will receive something. And we were playing around with the idea of promising incentives without delivering them, and promising incentives and then delivering them. And we ran it for a handful of weeks, and then we interviewed a lot of these people because we wanted to understand whether they remembered that there was some incentive going on if they reported correctly, and whether they appreciated that. And curiously, we found that they don't need incentives, which I think is very positive for 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 um, for the perception we have on users, because there's often these myth of people not caring about cybersecurity and people being reckless clickers and reckless users of computer systems. And instead, we found that in this company where we were testing the follow-up, people were already feeling responsible for the security. So most of the people we interviewed, they completely forgot that they were promised an incentive. Even when they received it, they were like, ah, okay. I don't even remember why. Okay, cool. I got this box of chocolate. It's
Wow.
amazing. And then we were asking, hey, do you think this, was a deciding factor when you were clicking and reporting with such accuracy and such timeliness the fishes? And the common answer was no, I don't care, because I know it's also my duty and my responsibility to protect the company from cyber attacks. So if I spot something, I just click and report because it's the correct thing to do. And I know this, and I was trained for this. And I think this is very positive. So this demystifies a bit the myth of people not caring and people needing incentives or needing spoon feeding. So I think as long as reporting is easy, a smooth process and a clear process of what happens when you report, in getting some feedback back, um, in having a convenient way, for example, a button that allows you to click very quickly and to
Mhm.
report very quickly an email that then disappears, but then it's also clear why it's disappearing and where it's going. So as long as this is clear, we found out people don't need big incentives. And if you have such people that are actually knowledgeable, they will keep on doing that because it's the right thing to do. And I think a company can find that out through this use of simulated emails and by measuring for a while. You will find out who your MVPs, who your superstars in terms of security awareness are. And I know there's a lot of companies and there's a lot of attention in trying to build um, a more gamified, for example, environment around this idea of reporting, around this idea of being awareness champions, for example, for your
Mhm.
colleagues. This I find very interesting, but for the reporting itself, we found out it doesn't really matter too much because people will do that because it's the right thing to do.
I see. Yeah, it's all a question of values in the end. It's like I'm a good. It's about being a good citizen. It's about being helpful to the company, doing what's right in the end. And it feels wrong to get something for when you do something that's right, I guess. Like leaving your seat on the bus, for instance, you wouldn't expect someone else to give you gift. You just do it because you feel like you're a good person. So I think it works similarly in phishing and having to report. Daniela, I'd love to talk about another finding in your research. So you identified, depending on the use and on different how do you call those, demographic data,
Mhm.
how likely a person would be to click, who clicks more, is it men and women and different things like this. Can you summarize these results a bit? Who in organizations is most likely to fall to phishing?
Yes, so we wanted to test a bit all this demographic information because well, they're easily available without violating the privacy of the employees that we cared for while running the study. Because anyway, we were external to the company, right? But also we wanted to see whether we could confirm or demystify some results that are out there in literature. Because we often saw papers from the past 10, 15 years discussing different age ranges, but they were done in not very diverse populations, for example, or discussing gender susceptibility to phishing, which I found immediately a bit odd. And it was also one of the main controversies in terms of different publications. So we wanted to test for these simple variables. And well, first of all, we tried to measure for age, and there we found maybe a bit unsurprisingly, that the ones that are the most vulnerable to phishing are very young employees, which, however, we started investigating a bit why through interviews, and it can be related both to a bit. Uh, both to a lack of specific computer knowledge and specific skills that you might acquire over the course of the years and with computer use over the years. But also we heard many times um, discussions about onboarding, for example. So a lot of people that were falling and they were in the younger side of the population. They recently joined the company and they were still unaware of the specific procedures, of how the company internal processes work.
Mm.
So when you try to fish, for example, when you try to send a scam that involves a new system for entering vacation days. Um, we got complaints by these people that said, yes, I think I could have spotted it. However, I was not aware of the internal processes of the company to handle these. And so I think there is a factor related to age, but one should also ask themselves whether it's about age or age at the company, which is something that might
Mm.
matter a lot. And also more senior people who might have simply less computer education because of less years of use again. And then we found, surprisingly, also a huge imbalance between genders. So we did find a lot of women being way more likely to click and fall for phishing emails than men. But then there we stopped and we tried to analyze whether our population was actually hiding some other patterns in the data that were going beyond gender. And what we found out was that the majority of the women in our study, they were actually working in post offices. So they were part of what we said we call a very specialized computer use. It's not a general purpose computer use. These are people who spend 8 hours in front of a computer during their workday, but they mostly need to use a specific piece of software, a specific interface, yet they still also have to manage emails, for example, and they might be expected to be active in online communication tools. And then, if you, instead of factoring in for gender, you start analyzing these ways of computer use, then you find out that actually whether you're male or female doesn't matter, which confirms our initial intuition that this doesn't matter. And what
Mhm.
actually matters is how you work with a computer. And this means that these people in these offices probably they are less trained than office workers. Yet they anyway spend so many hours in front of a computer. But again, similarly to age, they might be less aware of the company processes, of the procedures, of the different online services of the company, of the different ways to do stuff. And this might explain why they were a bit more vulnerable. So again, I think what we show, I mean, there's a part that we show that is about age, that is about computer use, but I think one of the main results of this paper and of our research is the importance of measuring properly in your own company, because every company is different in terms of onboarding, in terms of how people interact with computers. It shows that one needs to measure their own organization very carefully to account for all possible different variables. In research, we call them confounds because they are factors that they might add confusion to your data, and try to understand really where some surprising elements or some very defined biases might come from. So, for example, now this company knows that rather than acting on women, they need to act on people working with computers in this very specific way, because that's why they are vulnerable, rather than simply saying, hey, we must create, I don't know, Women Cybersecurity Awareness Day or some other
I see.
pointless initiative like that.
So if I understand correctly, then it's all about two things. One, the use of computers, and two, how you talk a lot about procedures. So it seems to me that procedures are also quite a significant, having clear, set, and let's say procedures that won't change all the time is a key factor in people not falling for phishing.
I think so. I think attackers thrive in this type of confusion, of course. They thrive, for example, in when people are allowed to use a lot of different communication media in a company. So imagine if you are forced to only use your company email address. And that's the only way
Mhm.
you can communicate, or you can only use Microsoft Teams, for example, where it's a closed world where everybody's issued an account. And then, unless someone gets compromised, then you can trust whoever's on the other side. But now, all of a sudden, if it's possible that you might receive an email from someone above you, from their personal Gmail that says, hey, please move some money, and if this is accepted at the company and it's something that could happen, then of course attackers thrive in that because they can attempt to do that. And we saw cases of, not in my studies, we saw cases of cyber attacks in the media in previous years that worked on that. So attackers thrive on this ambiguity of communication means, and they thrive on ambiguity of computer systems, of having many different systems to do things, and on not knowing the correct procedures, of course, because then they can try and sneak in and be like, hey, you now must do this on this new system that you never heard of, and this change was unannounced. And if people fall for that, it means maybe there's also something underlying, where, for example, the change of the way to enter your work hours should be communicated in advance, right? And people, if all of a sudden they get an email that says, hey, report your vacation in the new system within 1 week, new system that you never heard of, or you're going to lose your days, of course, you might get people worried. But if employees know that this is not possible because this is not the way it works, then attackers will lose this leverage, and will lose this. And this applies, in my opinion, from the simplest phishes, where attackers simply try to impersonate your boss and be like, hey, uh, trust me, Sergeant, buy me 5 iTunes gift cards. Don't ask questions. We need it now, which of course not very successful, but still works, and still people do try that. To more sophisticated ones, where you might also get an attacker that has insider knowledge, either from a previous compromise, or because they were at the company and now they turn to crime, for example. Because you
Mm-hmm.
need to assume that attackers might know some stuff about your internal procedures, and so you might want to realize ones that are resilient to this.
I see. Oh, very, very interesting point. I agree with this. Procedures, the more simple, the more straightforward it is, the more least likely you are to fall to phishing, and honestly, the more efficient you'll be in just in general. Daniele, we talked about the one thing that I found interesting about your study is that we talked a lot about the likelihood. So who is more likely to fail, and depending on their position, depending on several things we talked about. One thing that I like to talk about, because likelihood is one of two factors in measuring risk, because we have likelihood and severity. Now, one assumption that I have, and I like to talk about it, is that severity depends on who you phish ultimately. Because if you phish an accountant who has power to transfer money, it's not the same as, let's say, an intern who works in as very little data. So perhaps if we have money for training against phishing, how should we assess who gets it? How should we prioritize who are the people at risk, knowing both likelihood and severity aspects? Is that something you've considered before?
I like this definition. I really like this definition of severity. It's something we did not measure because we preserved these employees' privacy, so we did not know which role they had in the company. We only had more basic demographics. I think that one should prioritize only up to a point, because we saw with a lot of cyber attacks that quite often getting some low-level access, so a low-level employee can be already a very good foothold inside an organization, because you can start from there and then you have access to emails, you might have access to colleagues of this person, and you might be able to escalate your way, because we are used to different threat actors in phishing, and some of them are what we call less motivated. They care for more immediate financial gains, and they want to get some access, maybe to spam, maybe to get some short-term return. But we also saw a lot of cyber attacks happening in the previous years in big organizations, where someone at a lower level was phished, but then the attackers were persistent, and they stayed inside and they kept their access, and then they did what we call usually in cybersecurity as lateral movements. So basically slowly trying to escalate and slowly trying to reach someone who is more valuable. So I think education should be broad. Of course, I think that the more higher up in a hierarchy of an organization, the more maybe training should be slightly more specific and slightly more targeted. And if you are a C-level, I think might want to be more aware in general, of course. And the processes of the company for you should also be slightly more severe, slightly more demanding, probably, so that together the exec and the company, through their processes, try to mitigate the most cyber attacks. But I think in general, training should be probably even continuous and should be delivered to everyone. And I know this is difficult because quite often organizations, they get a budget and then they do have to prioritize a bit, and working with simulations, simulated phishing might be a bit expensive because still you require some either internal or external provider that prepares different emails and different scams, basically. And you want scams of a higher quality, you want scams of a lower quality, because you want to test all across the spectrum. You want to not only have super targeted, high quality, high level attacks that go for full impersonation with a lot of knowledge of the internal structure of the organization. You also want to test your waters a tiny bit more with more generic things. But of course, severity is then difficult to assess in this broader framework where someone might get access and might stay silent in your organization for days, weeks, maybe even months, until it's the
Mhm.
right moment to strike, because maybe they can manage to get access to something that is way more valuable. And I think this leads to this main thing, this main result of our research, that is the idea of continuous training through email simulations and through immediate education when someone falls for such an attack, by telling them, hey, you were wrong, you made a mistake, this was an exercise,
Yeah.
nothing happened,
If you
but
don't
this
mind me,
is,
Daniele, I'll just introduce the last point because that's exactly what I want to talk about. So one of the your study was awesome, and one thing that people retain the most is that the counterintuitive idea that certain phishing exercises could prove not only not effective, but also counterproductive towards protecting organizations against cybersecurity. Now you're making an excellent bridge. Can you tell us what kind of how could it be that some exercises are bad? Can you tell us more about why that is?
yeah, this is probably the most counterintuitive and maybe even controversial result of our research. I agree.
Mhm.
And we got a lot of attention due to this finding. We also saw it cut in different ways. So we saw it used to say this contextual embedded training does not work at all. Phishing simulations are dumb. We should stop them. I think these results need to be really interpreted in a more complex way. Um, so first of all, I still think that phishing simulations are a fantastic tool for companies. I still think they are the number one way to measure how your security posture is at a given point in time, if you want to take a snapshot of your organization, but also over time to see if there's any evolution. I think what's being called here for attention is again something that I mentioned before with demographics, the importance of measuring and of how you measure the different components of cybersecurity and awareness you are deploying. So what we are showing here is that if we deliver training in this way, and if we deliver some training, it might actually get people to be more vulnerable to phishing eventually. And this calls for more specific and more precise measurement. Why is that? And we are working a lot on that. And I think any company who would like to investigate more about it should take their awareness program, should, for example, keep a bunch of people untrained for some amount of time so that you have proper control. And if that's not possible, well, we did that for them somehow. But then it's important to measure every element of the chain, because here we are seeing a weird interaction, I think, between user mental models, employee mental models of what's going on, and the fact that this training is anyway a complex training. So we asked ourselves, why is that? And I think this shows the importance of measuring, is the training material maybe of lower quality than we expect, and so it makes people more confused about the problem. So is it a matter of the knowledge we are delivering? Or is it the fact itself that you enter your password on something you think is legitimate? Because let's remember, these people thought they were doing something that mattered for the company. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of mistakes over the course of 1.5 years. So a pretty high vulnerability to phishing. And then all of a sudden they see this web page appear after they enter their credentials that says, whoops, careful, you fell for phishing, don't take the bait, or something catchy along that line. Maybe and what is happening here? Do people maybe think that they were victims of a real cyber attack, of a real fish, and then they were protected by a system of the company that saw their credentials going out and magically or pseudo magically blocked them and saved them? And this is possible, right? Because we interviewed a lot of people after this to understand a bit more what was going on. And the general perception, which is also confirmed by a lot of literature, is that your work email account is way more secure than your home one. So we have a lot of people also being very confused in the difference between what's phishing, what's simply spam, what's simply noise that you might receive. And a lot of people were telling us, well, no, at home I receive a lot of spam, and here at work, never. So I know my inbox here is very secure and I can trust what's going on in my organization email-wise. And this shows, unfortunately, overconfidence and shows
Mhm.
overconfidence on the system. So, is it possible that people who would see this message appear that told them what was wrong thought it was actually a real protection system from a real attack because they're not used? Or is it possible that simply some people figured out that this was an exercise and then they decided, I don't know, to game the system to quote unquote troll it by entering some credentials and then, just to make fun of IT services, which of course is terrible because it means that the moment they receive a real phishing email, maybe not even high quality, they might think is another simulation. And then they might click on it and enter credentials because, well, it's just a game. And this is exactly the wrong type of message that we want to pass with these exercises. So I think
Mhm.
companies should really focus on measuring a bit more clearly all the different steps from the perception of the employees to the actual training material quality and to whether people have it clear that this was actually a simulation, but they should never engage with such an email if they report detect something weird. So actually to bridge with your very first question, the importance of reporting not only when you know you spotted a scam, but also simply if you are in doubt, because if you are in doubt about some email, the procedure in a company, the process should be reported if in doubt, because this might add some load to your IT admins, it might add some load to some automated appliance that tries to understand a bit more in depth what's going on with an email compared to your regular filters that you deploy in front of everything. But while this is creating additional load, this is for sure lower than the cost of a cyber attack and the cost of a compromise. And so I think we're seeing different elements. So when in doubt, report, I think is a message that our paper shows should be the main message that companies give to their employees. And to companies, what I want to say with these results is let's try to understand whether these exercises are causing some weird side effects by measuring what is going on and by measuring whether changing the type of information you are delivering to your employees makes it more clear, whether the current practices make people confused or make people annoyed, make people maybe a bit disgruntled because they think they are wasting their time in such futile exercises, for example, if they are noticing. And we are working on follow-ups on that. Our impression is that people don't think there were magic systems defending them, but people are genuinely confused about this type of exercises, about what is going on when they click on something, whether it is simulated. And so I think communication probably during the different steps of this type of training should be more clear. I don't think this type of training should be abandoned, but I think it should be measured very, very thoroughly in every
I see.
different organization, because every organization has different training material. They have different quality of training pages. They communicate differently how these exercises play on. And so I think, yeah, this shows that it cannot be deployed as a black box, but it needs to be deployed as something that gets continuously monitored, and where the results you're seeing are actually analyzed and thought of, and maybe also A/B tested to try different things, and talking to people also. Interviewing employees is very important, and it gives a lot of visibility on these problems.
Of course, yeah, communication and understanding on across all levels of the organization. Daniele, thanks for your time. Perhaps one last question.
Sure.
If you had to give to a business leader, let's say as a CEO, three tips, actionable tips on how they can reduce phishing in the organization, what would you tell them?
Well, the first keyword would be education for sure, a broad spectrum of education mechanisms that has to be complemented by yearly retraining, for example, e-learning and interactive exercises, but also these continuous testing and continuous monitoring. Then I guess actually monitoring would be the second
Mm-hmm.
one. And well, a word I used so often during this conversation was appropriate and scientific measuring with not only just blindly measuring one number and seeing if it is going up and down, but also asking yourself why. Proper randomization of exercises, proper randomizations of tests, trying to reduce all possible elements that might simply make numbers more favorable for you, but in the end are just lying to you.
Mm-hmm.
And these would be the three keywords I hope stick somehow after reading our paper.
Nice. And so, lastly, perhaps metrics. Can you recommend some metrics that can influence as like for monitoring purposes? What kind of metrics are we recommending here?
So, well, this is a very huge question that I think would
Uh-huh.
deserve probably a full episode by itself.
Okay, maybe
But
next time.
just to give a few elements that might be worth thinking about. Um, we saw some difference between, for example, the main metrics you use to quantify phishing vulnerability, that is, how many people click in links, for example, on a phishing email or on a phishing message, and how many actually then fall for the actual credential stealing or performing some bad action. Might it be downloading a malicious file, moving some money, doing something they shouldn't do, communicating wrongly? um, I think these metrics need to be both taken into account, because click rate by itself is interesting. You don't want your people to go around, click around, and open weird pages, because that might be dangerous. But also, people, well, the job of a lot of people is reading emails and clicking on links and opening attachments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we cannot
Yeah.
punish them for that. And if someone is exploring and if someone is opening a web page to check their legitimacy, that's all right, right? It is way more threatening if they actually interact with the web page. And these metrics, they need to be taken carefully. I make you a very simple example. Say I'm a malicious Chief Information Security Officer, and not malicious in the sense of I want my employees to fall for scams, but I want job security. So I want numbers to go up at the end of the day.
Mm.
So what can I do? I do three phishing campaigns. The first one is very hard. The second one is medium difficulty, and the third one is trivial to spot from everyone. At the end of the year, if I make a plot of people falling for phishing over time, of course, this line is going down. But is
Mm.
your organization really getting more resilient to phishing? Is this showing something about the trend? Of course not, right? And this is why these metrics are complicated because um, you need to randomize, you need to send different difficulties of emails at different points in time to different people so that you minimize, first of all, the effects, the unpredictable effects that you might have if one email, one specific campaign you're making is extremely easy or extremely hard, which might happen. And often you don't know in advance. We observed in our studies crazy success rates for something we thought was very easy to spot, but we hit, for example, we hit what I would say the golden moment for phishing. It was back to the office after summer and after one of these COVID lockdowns, and
Mm-hmm.
the mail was about badge access renewal. They had to do something, enter credentials,
Oh.
make sure they could enter still their building, something like that. And we
Mm-hmm.
observed a crazy high amount of people because it was, just a golden moment. Does it mean that the company is super vulnerable? No, we just hit a lucky moment. And if this was spread over time, we wouldn't observe that. Um, and so randomization is very important. You also want to minimize word of mouth because while if you receive a real cyber attack that is condensed with thousands of emails, identical emails to your employees over the span of a few hours, then word of mouth is super precious because you just need someone to notice that and to tell their colleagues, hey guys, hey folks, be careful. There's this thingy going around and I just spotted it. I reported it, but don't click. That's very valuable. Word of mouth
Mm-hmm.
is valuable and it's something that should be encouraged. But if I'm running phishing exercises and I want to focus on these click rate metric and fall through metrics, then I want to minimize word of mouth because I want to actually test employees as if they were an island, a famous poet would say. And I want to see them, snapshotted in that moment alone in front of their computer. And so these metrics are very, very valuable. These are the main ones that I consider in my research and I know companies consider. And I think they mostly need attention rather than new metrics. There's a lot of interest in fancier, new, more advanced metrics that, for example, build behavioral profiles of single individuals. So if you know that someone is more vulnerable, then the fact that they fell for yet another email tells you less than if someone who never fell for any starts falling. So maybe it's also not only absolute numbers, but maybe the numbers should also be put in relationship with the past behavior of a specific employee and the past behavior on these type of phishing exercises. So this is also, I think, a very promising avenue for better research and for maybe building specific employee models that tell you more about when someone is falling, whether this is something really bad or if it's something expected that should only add a tiny bit to your overall security posture status, for example. So that's also another promising avenue that I think is very worth
Well,
investigating.
you're right. There could be a whole episode of how you measure uh, on the global level, but also on one employee side, what are the outliers that say that need a little bit more work and things like this.
Mhm.
Daniele, if people want to reach out to you, where should they go? And,
I'm very happy to be reached out, of course. So, I can be reached out on my academic email. That's daniele.lain at inf.ethz.ch. But I can also be found with Google search. Luckily, I am apparently quite unique. My website is daniele.lain.fyi.
Mhm.
That's my academic website where I keep publishing my research and updating on what we are working on phishing, which is my main focus research-wise right now, because I find it such a fantastic intersection of human behavior, human computer interaction, and technical elements. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn under my name, and I'm very happy to hear from listeners what they thought about it. And if they have further questions or if they want to collaborate, know more about our results, I'm very, very happy to be reached out.
Nice. Thank you, Daniele.
Of course, thank you for having me. I think it was very interesting conversation. Hope the same for you.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.